Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, Your Excellencies. I am grateful for the vivid interest expressed towards our position on the Ukrainian issue and international affairs in general. This roundtable discussion is devoted to the crisis provoked by the West around Ukraine. They are trying to turn it into an anti-Russia by dumping weapons and turning it into a tool of unleashing war against our country. This is one of the most acute issues on the international agenda, although, let me be frank, we do see attempts of using the scale of the crisis and rhetoric around Ukraine, including on international platforms, in order to distract the international community from this issue and other issues, including the Palestinian issue. We welcome the actions undertaken by President Donald Trump. And most importantly, after the first phase of his initiative, the hostages were released and the bodies were returned to be buried in accordance with the religious traditions. Now we are all expecting the second phase of the settlement. And given all the humanitarian nature of the plan, it does not provide for a solid, sustainable solution for the Palestinian issue in accordance with the UN resolutions, which does not inspire optimism. Nevertheless, today we are here to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. And if I may, I will say a few words regarding our views of the current stage of the developments around this topic. We are meeting when every day mass media broadcast various messages and evaluations which I would say raise additional hopes that a diplomatic solution for the conflict around Ukraine is near. All of these expectations are fed up with more active contacts between the various international players, amid numerous messages saying that the economies of the state sponsors of the Kyiv regime, primarily the Euro bureaucrats, as well as the majority of the members of the EU and NATO, are experiencing economic crisis. We see numerous speculations and destructive information campaigns and fakes. We believe that the main goal of such activities initiated by our Western colleagues is to exacerbate seeking the negotiation solution and to prolong the conflict. They are trying to downplay the initiatives of the United States and President Trump, which are truly aimed at finding an acceptable solution that would contribute to eliminating the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. No one in Europe even mentions the root causes, and moreover, they request an immediate cessation of hostilities by providing space and time for Ukraine and for the Europeans in order to provide them with additional funds or weapons. I will share the most recent piece of news with you. As reported, there have been contacts on the phone between President Trump, President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, as well as Friedrich Merz. The official representative of the German government, a certain Mr. Cornelius, is making a public statement saying that the four heads of state and governments have discussed the ongoing negotiations regarding the ceasefire in Ukraine. Only a ceasefire. Europe is not concerned with anything else, while Russia insists that we need to achieve a package deal on a sustainable long-term peace with security guarantees for all the involved parties. Our negotiations with the US President and his team are devoted to finding a long-term settlement solution and the elimination of the root causes of this crisis, while Western Europe, as seen from the statement by the German official that I have just quoted, only thinks about a ceasefire in order to take a pause and to prepare Zelensky and his regime to a new war against the Russian Federation. This is exactly why today we will try to separate the wheat from the chaff and analyze the dynamics of the events throughout this year and try to inform you of our views of the experience we have accumulated, which affects the decision-making process regarding the talks, the formats, the time frames, and the future. First, a brief look into history. I'm sure many of you are aware of how this issue originated. Nevertheless, I would like to say briefly, once again, that under the Biden administration, it was the United States that became the main sponsor of the Kyiv regime. And after the violent coup d'etat in February 2014, the well-known Madam Victoria Nuland, then Deputy Secretary of State, speaking in the Senate, was proud to say that Ukraine is going through the right process, and this is why the US had invested $5 billion into the country, which, according to her, was a right decision in order to support the trends that they called a feast of democracy, but in essence, it was just a coup d'etat, a putsch. Following the coup d'etat in 2014, the Americans assumed control over the Ukrainian political and economic systems and continued pumping the Ukrainian neo-Nazis with additional weapons. This is what Donald Trump inherited. While we remember that one of his most important campaign slogans regarding foreign policy was stopping the Ukrainian conflict as soon as possible, and we would like to pay respect where it's due. After assuming his post, President Trump started working on this issue, and we believe that he has a sincere wish to find a solution through diplomatic means. We welcome such activities. However, aspirations are not enough. We require practical steps to eliminate the root causes of the conflict. As stated by the President of Russia and our government, our position is that Russia does not accept Ukrainian involvement into NATO. In blatant disregard of the promises given to us regarding the NATO expansion, we also do not accept the activities of the Ukrainian regime to eliminate all things related to Russia and the Russian language in violation of the UN decisions, resolutions, and various international documents that provide for the protection of the rights of minorities, including language minorities, in all the activities and spheres of public life. I once again mention February 2014, the coup d'etat in Kyiv. Back then, we addressed the leadership of France, Germany, and Poland, calling upon them to effect the Ukrainian opposition, which organized the coup with the support and direction from the West. We asked the Europeans to request from the opposition to comply with the recently signed agreements with the Ukrainian president, an agreement on political settlement. Berlin, Warsaw, and Paris were the guarantors of the agreement between the opposition and the Ukrainian president at the day. It was the reputation of the Europeans at stake. We asked them to do something to bring the opposition back to reason. Imagine what would have happened had the Germans, French, and the Polish complied with their promises and kept their word. Perhaps a civil war could be avoided, and the regime that came to power after the coup d'etat did unleash a civil war immediately after taking power, they started a conflict against millions of their own citizens who rejected the legitimacy of this regime. Keeping in mind that back then, 11 or almost 12 years ago, the West refused to keep its promises, we have yet another answer showing the sincerity of the Western leaders to find a solution, of which there was none. Nevertheless, Russia continued seeking a diplomatic solution. You know, the Minsk agreements were agreed upon after many hours of nightly talks in the capital of Belarus, involving President Putin. We coordinated with our other leaders regarding the Minsk agreements, and they were unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council, and Article 25 of the UN Charter says that all UN members must comply with the decisions of the Security Council of the United Nations. However, these decisions were only seen by the West as something to win more time in order to continue providing additional weapons to the illegitimate Kyiv regime, to continue the preparations for a full-scale war against the Russian Federation. Those who had signed the Minsk agreements, namely France and Germany, President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel, as well as the foreign Ukrainian president, whose signature is also under the document, they only wanted to play for time, and they even openly admitted that a couple of years ago. In an interview during the special military operation, they said they never had any intention of complying with the Minsk agreements in the first place. They only needed that in order to alleviate the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces, which were quite deplorable, and to prepare the country for war with the Russian Federation. The so-called contact group also came to a stalemate. The contact group was also established at the decision of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany. The group was meant to promote the implementation of the Minsk agreements. However, they blocked this. This was done by the Kyiv regime and its Western sponsors. At the same time, Kyiv, with the assistance of NATO, continued to enhance its military capacity and increased the intensity of hostilities against the citizens of the southeast of Ukraine, who, as I mentioned, resolutely rejected the legitimacy of the opposition, the putschists, because immediately after coming to power following the coup d'etat in 2014, they said that they cancelled the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. Thereby, they made millions and millions of Ukrainian citizens essentially lawbreakers, because for centuries they were raised and born in a Russian-speaking culture. The southeast, Odessa and Nikolaev, are the cities that were founded and established by the Russians. All the factories, all the industries were built by the Russians. But later, as you know, under the Soviet Union, these lands, through bureaucratic procedures, ended up being transferred to Ukraine. That back then included the western territories like Galician. But most importantly, they disregarded the Minsk agreements. There was no peace process. There were no direct talks with the people of the southeast of Ukraine. The Kyiv regime did not want that, and they even openly stated that they would never communicate with the representatives of the southeast, even though this was directly stated in the Minsk agreements. And at the end of January, beginning of February 2022, the Kyiv armed forces significantly intensified their artillery strikes and shellings of the territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. This was confirmed by the reports of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. I will not go too deep into the details, since we have mentioned this numerous times. Most importantly, until the very end, Russia was preferring the diplomatic solution. In December 2021, 2 months before the beginning of the special military operation, we were only seeking a peaceful diplomatic solution. We gave our proposals to the United States and NATO. This was a draft package of documents aimed at finding security guarantees on our western track, and we suggested signing the legally binding agreements. However, the Americans and NATO rejected our proposals. Only when we realized that the West was going to provide a carte blanche to the Ukrainian nationalists for a forcible solution and suppression of those who rejected the coup d'etat, only then our president said that we had no other choice other than beginning the special military operation to protect the population of the southeast of Ukraine. The Kyiv regime was claiming that these people were non-human, that they were terrorists, which was a violation of all the norms of international humanitarian law. Ukraine was using regular army, artillery and military aircrafts against their own population in the southeast. However, until the very last moment, we were trying to find a diplomatic solution. Contacts with the Ukrainian side took place in Belarus several days after the beginning of the special military operation. They later continued in the Brest region of Belarus, as well as in Istanbul and through video link. But this dialogue was halted, and this was not our fault. I would say that the leadership of the United Kingdom played a very destructive and undermining role under the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In April 2022, he gave an order to Zelensky to reject the draft settlement plan proposed by Kyiv itself, which was already agreed upon. He said that Ukraine was supposed to fight to the very end in order to destroy the Russian economy and fighting capacity. This was the idea of that unkempt political leader of the United Kingdom. He believed that under the pressure of sanctions, Russia would end up in a political crisis which would destabilize the country. I would say the Europeans are still trying to achieve that. In other words, according to the Ukrainian strategists, Ukraine was supposed to become a ram to hit Russia. Ukraine was supposed to hold on until their economic pressure would break us and would break our resolve to protect the sovereignty and security of the state, as well as the dignity of the Russian people, who, through the will of history, ended up living in the territory of Ukraine. They could have continued living there were it not for the Ukrainian leaders. If only the Ukrainian leadership respected their own constitution, which, as I said, demands the protection of the rights of the Russian and other national minority languages.
They wanted to inflict a strategic defeat upon us, and after that to dictate Western conditions on matters that were of concern to European capitals. The plans on anti-Russian blitzkrieg using Ukraine has failed. As you know, the Russian society has shown its inner consolidation, and economy and political system have shown resilience and durability, and it is very important in terms of understanding this history of the matter. At all times when Russia was attacked, we always said that our cause is right. And this conviction that we are right in terms of legal aspects and history-wise, it reflects the nature, the character of our people, that ensures the current state of affairs in combating those who wanted to suppress all our legitimate rights and interests. As I have already mentioned in the beginning, today in the West, the resources to wage a proxy war, financial, material, technical, military resources are depleting, and the fatalities of the Ukrainian armed forces, according to numerous independent assessments, have long been over 1 million and counting. The Kyiv regime has turned from an ideologically driven squad that was fueled by the ideology of Nazism, Azov battalions, and other neo-Nazi entities, and it was also fueled by some banned substances, I would say. The Kyiv regime has turned into an organized criminal gang, mired in corruption, that is pulling its sponsors to the bottom. And against this backdrop, we can divide the ruling elites in the West into two camps. The majority stand for militarizing the economy of European countries and preparing for an outright military confrontation in Europe. Clearly, they hope that the war will write off everything, and their mistakes will be forgotten. I would like to mention Giuseppe Dragoni, chief of the military committee of NATO, and I quote, "We think about acting more aggressively instead of responding. The alliance, NATO that is, could consider preemptive strikes as defensive actions." End of quote. What's your take on that? How do you like that? Other figures, political activists, and military people think about preparing for war with Russia till 2030 or even 2029. And it is funny that this statement of the Italian commander who says that we need to have preemptive strikes, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Madam Giorgia Meloni, tried to justify his statements. She was asked about her take on this matter, and she said that these words should be interpreted in a right way in order to prevent a dangerous escalation. Is there any other way to interpret the words calling directly for preemptive strikes? Well, I'm sure that everybody understands what we're talking about. The West is out of despair trying to fuel tension and to keep on fighting. And as a follow-up to this matter, and by fueling this tension in the society using the so-called military threat by Russia, they hope that they will keep in power, they will not lose face. And according to our assessment, the majority of Western elites in Europe are doing that. The others, the minority, want to find a strategy out of the conflict. They want to find ways to de-escalate and to create conditions for the political settlement. This policy of the part of European countries follows the spirit of Donald Trump's administration. It has turned from words to action. It's been the case for quite some time, and it has used its influence on Kyiv to convince Zelensky to get back to negotiating process. We value these efforts, just like the readiness of a number of our countries to provide their platform for contacts, although, frankly speaking, Zelensky, with the support of various leaders in Brussels, Berlin, London, Paris, tries to undermine these efforts and make up some excuses in order to put Donald Trump out of the path that they have opted for, that seeks to have a long-term, durable settlement. They want to replace it with some bogus stories with the sole aim not to do anything. In spring this year, as you know, as something that confirms our readiness to have negotiations, in spring this year we have resumed direct bilateral negotiations in Istanbul. There were 3 rounds in May, June and July, and we took a responsible stance to these meetings. We provided our proposals to the Ukrainian side, the so-called draft memorandum on ways to settle the situation as we see it. We proposed to establish Russia-Ukraine ceasefire monitoring and control center for certain periods in order to address humanitarian matters. The Ukrainian side said Istanbul doesn't give us anything. We have just achieved certain agreements on humanitarian track, the return of bodies and POWs. We said, okay, let us establish certain working groups on humanitarian matters, on military matters, and on political matters. This proposal was also ignored. Then the Ukrainian delegation complained about the level of negotiating team in Istanbul. Allegedly, it is not that high, and this does not allow them to take serious decisions. And we suggested raising this level, and this was all ignored. All the initiatives that focused on any progress within the bilateral negotiations were refuted, rejected, or ignored, as I've already mentioned. And this once again confirmed that the Ukrainian regime does not want to have any decisions and solutions. I've already mentioned certain results on humanitarian track, exchange of bodies, POWs. Almost 2,500 persons from both sides managed to get back home, and we have organized the phased-in repatriation of those perished. Up until now, we have provided over 11,000 dead soldiers to Kyiv, and in response, we got 201 bodies of our fighters. Despite all the things that I've mentioned, Kyiv declared that there is a lack of any progress, and it made a decision to suspend negotiations with Russia. The West has not responded to that at all. It has not prompted the Kyiv regime to at least make an impression that it was ready to have a political solution. Despite all these developments, we have a clear impression. Negotiations in Istanbul were needed by the Kyiv regime for only one thing. Just like during the Minsk agreements, they wanted to ensure ceasefire without any conditions, under any pretext, and to get a respite for rearming, to respite their losses, to replenish their losses rather, and to regroup forces. We haven't done that, certainly, and there is another personal case for Zelensky. There is a raging corruption scandal in Ukraine, and in light of it, protracting the conflict, by the looks of it, became a matter of political or physical survival for Zelensky. For us, the negotiating settlement, as was recently highlighted by President Putin, is our preferred option. We have not abandoned negotiations, and that is confirmed by our constructive effort to consider initiatives by the United States. We value the aspiration of our BRICS partners to help bring about the environment to search for ways out of the crisis. Namely, I'm talking about the groundwork for the UN group in defense of peace and group of friends of peace in Ukraine. That was established by our friends in China and Brazil, and we believe that that is a sincere aspiration to make a constructive contribution to stabilizing the international environment. We need to build these efforts on the international law, primarily the UN Charter principles in their entirety, their full range and interconnectedness. It is important to ensure the lifting of root causes of the conflict, as I've already mentioned. It is the paramount condition for the durable peace. I've already mentioned the UN Charter principles. The West constantly talks about the UN Charter principles as a pillar for conflict settlement. However, Western statements are quite peculiar. It claims, well, recently, for instance, Merz claimed once again that it is necessary to settle the conflict building upon the UN Charter and the respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is a selective commitment to the UN Charter, because UN Charter speaks about many other things, including, among other things, equality and the right of nations to self-determination. And that is exactly the framework for the decolonization process, when peoples of primarily African countries refused to live under the authority of metropolis, because the colonial powers have never expressed and defended the interests of the African peoples. By the same token, today the Kyiv regime, and everybody understands that, the Kyiv regime cannot and does not reflect the interests of the peoples of Novorossiya, Donbass and Crimea, naturally. There are a lot of double standards here when the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter that was established by our partners is working to develop its philosophy. Certainly, we want for all the UN Charter principles to be taken into account, especially since the West forgets about yet another principle, the respect for the human rights. Any human, regardless of race, gender, language and religion. The Russian language in Ukraine, as well as the Orthodox canonical church, are banned by law. I know that here present are many countries that are making part of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. Given this context, I believe that within this group, we need to specifically highlight these aspects. Over the past year, within this group of peace in Ukraine, Western countries started participating in it. They are directly sponsoring the Kyiv regime, and hardly does it contribute to this goal. I'm talking about the participation of France and Switzerland. How can they be members of this group, even as observers, when they directly, in rhetorics-wise and practical-wise, they've been supporting the Kyiv regime? When it comes to the Americans, as I've already mentioned, according to our assessment, they are interested in getting to the crux of the matter of the Ukrainian file, and this was reflected during the meeting between President Putin and President Trump in Anchorage on the 15th of August. They reached mutual understandings, and they are still relevant for us, and they could become a starting point for the settlement. Recently, U.S. Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff visited Russia, and following his meeting with President Putin, both sides, the Russian and the American side, recognized and readmitted this mutual understanding that was reached in Alaska. This is a very important result because there was a certain break, a pause after the Anchorage meeting, and currently in our contacts with the Americans on the Ukrainian file, I believe that all the misunderstandings were alleviated. And the understandings that were reached in Anchorage are building upon the proposals that President Putin shaped in a general manner. In June 2024, we're talking about the principles to resolve the Ukrainian conflict. Prior to Alaska, Steve Witkoff also visited Moscow, and he came with the proposals that also were the framework for the understandings reached in Anchorage. The point of these understandings is that Ukraine should get back to non-bloc, neutral, and non-nuclear pillars of its statehood, and these principles are non-bloc status, neutrality, and non-nuclear status were enshrined in the Declaration on State Sovereignty of Ukraine of the 16th of July 1990, and building upon principles proclaimed in this document, we recognized the independence of Ukraine, and now they tell us, we cannot do anything because our constitution stipulates the goal of joining NATO. We recognized a different kind of Ukraine, and the majority of those present here recognized Ukraine in 1991 after the dissolution of the USSR as a country, as a state, building upon three principles: neutrality, non-nuclear status, and non-bloc status. Therefore, we should not have this play upon words. We should take into account the historical facts. And certainly, the Ukraine that became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union had in its laws and in its constitution the guarantees for the rights of Russians and of other national minorities, and that Ukraine did not institutionalize the Nazification of the civil society, and that is something that we're witnessing today. And certainly it is important for these understandings to get rid of discrimination regarding the Russian language and the Russian-speaking citizens, other national minorities. We know very well that the Hungarian, Bulgarian minority do not feel themselves as full-fledged citizens. Of course, we need to put an end to the persecution against the canonical Orthodox Church. When it comes to territorial realities, Zelensky says, I cannot do anything with the territorial matter because our constitution bans giving up anything. And certainly we can draw the attention of this person. Well, he clearly does not always remember what is happening around him, but I repeat for the third time today, this constitution enshrines the commitment of the state to respect the rights of Russians and other minorities. They don't care about these provisions. They adopted laws that directly ban the Russian language in education, in culture, in media. They simply created some kind of a filter in media outlets. You cannot work in media space if you criticize Zelensky. All media outlets are closed, the ones that were owned by Russians and those who are owned by Ukrainians but broadcast in Russian and that were criticizing the Zelensky regime. All these media outlets were shut down. And if they care about the integrity of the constitution when it comes to the rights of people and citizens, this is the most important thing, more important than anything else. Let me state once again, we have our own constitution. Under this constitution, Crimea, DPR, LPR, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions are part and parcel, and they are equal parts and regions of the Russian Federation. Let me once again highlight something that I have repeatedly stated. What we need is not territories. What we need And what we care about is the fate of people whose ancestors have been developing these lands for centuries. They built cities, roads, ports. Monuments were built there to the founders of these territories, and the rights of these people are being trampled upon, disrespected by the Kyiv regime. Therefore, the population of the Russian regions that I've mentioned back in the day during referendums refused to live under the rule of the neo-Nazi regime. And probably this is the topic that we cannot hush up.
I believe that those countries present here have the right understanding of human rights in full compliance with the principles of the UN Charter, which prohibits discrimination based on gender, race, or language, or religious foundations. And human rights, as seen by the West, are well known to us. By the way, after the United States distributed their document containing 28 or 27 points for the Ukrainian settlement, it was leaked to the media. You may have seen it already. There were quite important statements regarding human rights in it, as well as points concerning the denazification of Ukraine. In particular, the document said that Ukraine needed to protect the languages of the minorities as well as religious freedoms, and the entire Nazi ideology and activities shall be banned. Following contacts with the Europeans, the number of points in that plan was reduced, namely the point regarding the ban on all Nazi ideology and activities disappeared, obviously at the request of the Europeans and of course the Zelensky regime. Speaking of the rights of national minorities and religious freedoms, for some reason the text has a phrase now that Ukraine shall adopt the EU rules regarding the rights of national minority and religious freedoms. I think that we should raise a different question. I say that Ukraine shall comply with the UN Charter as well as the numerous international universal conventions regarding human rights, the rights of national minorities and religious freedoms. We should not reduce its obligations to only acting in accordance with the rules of the European Union. This is unacceptable. The rights of national minorities and religious freedoms are not limited and are not regulated by the European Union. The EU is free to do whatever it wants inside the Union, but they shall not impose their rules upon others. Besides, we know what kinds of minorities the EU is trying to protect these days, and these are not national minorities. And we know how they treat religious freedoms. Just take a look at the broadcast of the opening of the Olympics in Paris, and you will get the idea of the European ideas of religion and minorities. This is why we continue using the ideas that we are working upon with the Americans, the process that started in Anchorage in Alaska. We have sent additional proposals to the United States regarding the collective security guarantees. We understand that, speaking of security guarantees, we cannot limit ourselves to Ukraine alone. The proposals, which are currently being commented upon by Zelensky and his Western masters, have not been seen yet. But if the statements in the media are to be believed, the new proposals provide for, apart from the demilitarized zone and the creation of a certain buffer zone on both sides of the border without any heavy weaponry. There is no point in discussing this without Russia, but the same proposals say that Ukraine would have an 800,000 strong army. and that they would get security guarantees, as well as guarantees for the restoration of Ukraine. We are once again coming back to the notorious logic of the so-called Zelensky formula. Its sole purpose is to concentrate all the efforts on the support of the existing neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine without changing its nature, without changing its policy regarding the suppression of religious freedoms and human rights. At the same time, the legitimate interests and security concerns of the Russian Federation are left outside of the framework. Russia, by the way, ever since 2010 and even earlier, since 2008, we have made suggestions to NATO to sign a legally binding treaty regarding collective security guarantees. Even now, President Putin, during his meeting with Witkoff and Kushner a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago to be more precise, stated clearly that we understand that security guarantees must include the Ukraine as well. But the other side wants to ensure security for Ukraine only. And according to the media, they are stating their guarantees in such a way to prepare Ukraine for a new attack on the Russian Federation. Of course, we cannot accept this. We believe that the proposals that we had made in December 2021 to the United States and NATO are still fully relevant. These proposals could become a starting point for future discussions. Of course, we are open to any other ideas, but most importantly, we have the consensus to work from. These are the decisions of the summits of the OSCE in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010. They are still there and still relevant. These decisions of the OSCE summits say that each state has the right to choose their allies to ensure their security. And the second point is that no country shall reinforce its security by detrimenting the security of others. That's the second point. And the third principle stated in these documents of the OSCE summits says that no state, group of states or organization working in the OSCE space shall have any claim to dominance. But this is exactly what NATO has been doing consistently by devouring state after state. These are the countries located to the west of the Russian Federation. As we were drawing attention of the Western colleagues to the fact that they were not acting in a decent manner, that they were violating the obligations of their own prime ministers and presidents, they were saying that these are just political obligations and not legally binding obligations. That is the logic that the West is trying to follow. But this logic does not work. If they intend to continue working through this logic, we will end up in a bad situation. This is why we are ready to take into account all the existing proposals, which are elaborated in a collective manner in order to begin our talks. These proposals should pursue the aim of reaching the fundamental and legally binding agreement. This is of the utmost importance. We don't want to go from one crisis into another, and this is what the West and Europe wants. They are trying to sow the seeds of a new conflict, while publicly saying that they are preparing for such a conflict. We don't want our current efforts to be in vain, to repeat the fate of the Minsk agreements, which, I repeat, were approved unanimously by the UN Security Council, but this didn't stop the French, the Germans, or any other masters of the Zelensky regime. In their frenzy, trying to defeat Russia, they didn't stop at anything, as you know. Today, I already mentioned the 28-point plan of the Americans. Later, President Putin had a meeting here in Moscow with Stephen Witkoff. As I said, we confirmed the ideas elaborated in Anchorage in Alaska. Work shall continue. At the same time, we see the efforts of Europe. We see Zelensky going between London, Paris, and other European capitals. And from what we see from the media leaks, their purpose is to undermine the efforts of President Trump and his team. For the majority of these people, like Macron, Starmer, Merz, Tusk, Stroop, or von der Leyen, or Kallas, they see no profit in ending the conflict. They are still drumming up the conflict by establishing the so-called coalition of the willing, by increasing their military expenditure and trying to save their own political future, as I said in the beginning. They are ramping up the Russia scare, promote the ideas of a Russian attack in the future. Now they're even trying to reduce the dates and the time of transferring their troops to the Ukrainian borders. They are still having and harboring fantasies of sending their own military troops to Ukraine as so-called peacekeepers. But these so-called peacekeepers would immediately become legitimate targets for the Russian armed forces. The Europeans must understand that. They are forced to admit the fact that the British servicemen are directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine. The British Special Forces are taking part. After one of them was killed, the British government could not hide the circumstances. They said that at least 100 British subjects are currently located there fighting against the Russian Federation. This is what we heard tonight or this morning. We will draw all the necessary conclusions regarding the true nature of the UK authorities and regime. The European Union is making plans of increasing the numbers of its servicemen at the borders with Russia and Belarus. Poland is planning to ramp up the productions of 155mm rounds, and they are planning a 30-fold increase of the production. And they are claiming that they are not preparing for war. They even say they want to play a role in the peace process. Even Macron is saying that no one can make a decision without Europe. Our president said openly that we are not harboring any aggressive plans against NATO or the European Union. We are ready to provide written legal guarantees on a collective and mutual basis in the context of our approaches. I repeat that Russia stands by its word and we keep our promises. As stated by the President, if Europe decides to wage war, we are ready for that right now. The legal aggression continues. They are using their puppet structure like the International Criminal Court or the Europol. They are trying to establish a special tribunal in the European Court, as well as the Damages and Losses Commission. And they are trying to get the countries presented here involved in the processes. They are trying to make sure the representatives of the global majority are involved in their formats, including the 15th to 16th of December so-called diplomatic conference in The Hague. At the conference, they are planning to sign an international claims commission which would review the claims of the Nazi regime against the Russian Federation. Even though we were protecting the Russian people from killing, from the destruction, we were protecting their rights in accordance with the UN Charter. This is what the Western liberals and human rights proponents are doing. We understand that they are trying to expand the geography of their anti-Russian campaign. They are trying to get the countries of the global south involved in their provocative actions. They are trying to drive a wedge in the relations between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America. I have no doubt that our friends and partners in these regions understand this clearly. They will not fall victim to these provocations by the West. The Ukrainian state sponsors and their position have been stated by Madam Kallas. She said that EU has a clear plan of 2 points. The first point is to weaken Russia. The second one is to support Ukraine. End of quote by Kaja Kallas. This is a masterpiece of diplomatic art, I would say, worthy of the quote by Annalena Baerbock, who was demanding that Putin should change his policy by 360 degrees. Europe, through Kaja Kallas, is saying that their main goal is to support Ukraine. We see that the support of the Kyiv regime by Europe includes the robbery, the planned robbery by the European Union of the Russian assets. They are planning to confiscate the sovereign assets, the currency reserves of the Russian Federation. The representatives of the West, the Prime Minister of Belgium, the leadership of the European Reconstruction and Development Bank and the International Monetary Fund are warning the Brussels bureaucracy against these reckless actions. But we will see whether this will have any effect on the political figures like Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas, whose diplomacy is very blatant and open. They must understand that they will be kept responsible for such actions. By the way, Madam Kaja Kallas recently made another statement and made another Freudian slip. She said, in particular, that Ukraine does not need a very quick settlement. More statements by the head of the German intelligence service, Mr. Kall, said that it is good for Europe for the Ukrainian conflict to continue for several more years, while the European countries would enhance their own military capacity, preparing for war with Russia. These are the things stated by the ideologists of the anti-Russian war. These are the statements made by the European politicians for their own domestic audience. Their argument, first of all, is that they should support the Kyiv regime because it is fighting for European values. They are admitting their guilt. In essence, this means that the European leadership is promoting neo-Nazism in Ukraine, the country which glorifies the criminals, those who were convicted by the Nuremberg Tribunal, the country that pursues an anti-Russian policy, the country that has a legal ban on the Russian language and all things Russian, which persecutes the Russian culture, Russian media, the Russian Orthodox Church. No one in Europe says that this is a violation of the UN Charter and the Ukrainian international obligations. This is what it looks like. This is what the European values look like. This should be a lesson for everyone. And the most recent work in the protection of the European values is demonstrated by the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. This is not a public organization. It was established 20 years ago by the government of Ukraine. It has a status of a central body of the executive authorities tasked with preserving national memory. This organization has lists of people and organizations who are accused of undermining the interests of the Ukrainian people and are subject to the policy of so-called decommunization and decolonization.
As people that represent a threat to the Ukrainian state and people, and it is officially declared that this list includes writers Turgenev, Bulgakov, Kataev, Ilf, Babel, Zhvanetsky, Pushkin, Lermontov, composers Glinka, Mussorgsky, artists Surikov, and others. And of course, this black list that includes the activists of imperialism that pose a threat to Ukraine. This includes the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas II and his family, Lomonosov, Bagration. Out of law are Poltava and Borodino battles. Therefore, it is hard to guess that with such degree of common sense, the Kyiv regime would be ready for any serious negotiations and, most importantly, for any serious agreements. Probably this should be taken into account by those who keep on insisting that any decisions to overcome the Ukrainian crisis should involve only the Kyiv regime and his European handlers. As for the attitude of Europe towards Zelensky and his regime as the ones that are sinless and that should be supported under any circumstances, and this too shows that Ukrainian leaders also don't have much common sense. And this raises question whether they can play a useful role in negotiations to achieve a durable, sustainable settlement that would build upon the UN Charter principles and the principles of the international law. Unlike this group of people, we have the political will towards peace. President personally, and let me highlight this once again, talks about his readiness to have a meaningful dialogue, primarily with the American side, because it is the one who shows serious intention to achieve results. And we do want to put an end to the conflict. Our principal position has not changed. It is possible to do that if we alleviate the root causes of the conflict that are well known to everyone. And I believe that you also understand that. Hopefully, the additional arguments and assessments that we outlined today and that we will outline following your questions will be useful for your governments as they assess the situation, as they define their actions in this regard. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Mr. Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, you have a chance to ask your questions. Over to you. Bahrain, over to you.
Good morning, Your Excellency Minister Sergei Lavrov. It's my honor on behalf of Their Excellency the Arab Ambassador to extend our sincere appreciation of convening this open dialogue today. Your Excellency, the Alaska summit between Presidents Putin and Trump constituted a significant breakthrough and overcome the diplomatic impasse surrounding the Russian-Ukraine crisis. The international community received it with optimism, and His Majesty the King of Bahrain dispatched 2 cables of congratulation and support to both presidents in recognition of their effort to achieve a resolution to this conflict. Nevertheless, the European states did not endorse this initiative, and it appears evident that that they continue to harbor doubt and mistrust towards Russia, despite the fact that the ongoing war poses substantial risk to the European continent. I would like Your Excellency to pose the two questions. First, in Your Excellency's view, what explains Europe's apprehension towards Russia? The second question, why did Russia not take the initiative to propose insurance or security guarantees to Europe that might have encouraged it to support the American initiative? Thank you.
When it comes to concerns and fears by Europe regarding the Russian Federation, our plans, I cannot understand the rationale behind the European leaders. Take a look at what they say, and probably it would become clear that it is pointless to get inside their head and to put ourselves in their shoes. Take Finland, for instance. For many years after the war, it was our good neighbor. We have overcome the dire period that existed in our relations prior to World War II, at the beginning of this war, and especially after the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. The Finnish army most actively participated in the war against Russia, including they provided substantial forces to ensure inhumane, unparalleled siege of Leningrad. Besides German troops, Finnish troops were involved there. After that, we have overcome this period in history, and for many decades, we have been living as good neighbors. The border was open for visits by people in both directions. The Finnish industry, including shipbuilding and timber industry, they were developed thanks to cheap energy provided by Russia. We had a mutual beneficial win-win trade, cultural ties, and all of a sudden, as if masks were off, our Finnish colleagues, including the current president, Alexander Stubb, who was my counterpart, foreign minister, and he resembled quite a serious, responsible politician, and Finland has turned into one of the most Russophobic states. It tries to be among the first countries to punish Russia and never to agree on anything with Russia, but just keep on fighting and have hostilities. The current Foreign Minister of Finland, Madam Valkonen, said, and I quote, "No matter what happened, Russia would remain a long-term strategic threat to the Euro-Atlantic security. We need to keep Russia at a distance." Putin has not deviated from the demands of December 2021. If they are taken, they would bring to naught all the progress in terms of European security. And if we agree to these demands, it would make Europe face another wave of aggression. It is steered by the foreign minister of a country which saw the beginning of the meeting on the security and cooperation in Europe, and it later on turned into the OSCE, the organization that proclaimed at the summit level the principles that we should not ensure our security at the expense of others, and that is exactly the framework for the proposals that were pitched by President Putin in December 2021, and Madam Valkonen rejects these proposals as unacceptable because they would bring to naught decades of progress in terms of European security. I want her to hear that these proposals were the last chance to save the achievements in European security that are still existing and that the West is trying to trample upon together with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and of course with Finland as a country that saw the birth of the spirit of Helsinki. This country should care about that. Nevertheless, Valkonen, with a light heart, opts for the Nazi regime. In Europe, Europe tries to get its seat at the negotiating table by all means, but the ideas hatched by Europe would not be useful for the negotiations. They need to take a look on themselves from a different side. They should be serious and should take a serious approach. They should not have this propaganda. And you had the second question, namely, you were talking about security guarantees. Our proposal on security guarantees is well known and they are publicly accessible. We made them in December 2021 and they are crystal clear. Basically, we're talking about indivisible security, but not in a way of political commitments, but legal commitments with the respective verification mechanisms. But that is exactly that the European part of the West does not want to see, because they keep on seeing an eternal enemy in Russia. Thank you so much. The International Red Cross. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Your Excellency. I'm the head of delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross for the Russian Federation and Belarus. First of all, allow me to thank you personally, as well as the organizers of this important briefing, for extending the invitation to ICRC and other humanitarian organizations, especially ahead of a potential settlement of the crisis. Allow me also to underline once again the importance of taking into consideration the humanitarian aspects of any peace or conflict settlement, and to humbly mention that the ICRC stands ready to flesh out with all parties all these aspects as the only international humanitarian actor present across the conflict. My question is, from the Russian Federation's perspective, what would be the key humanitarian components of a sustainable settlement for this crisis? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We value the contribution that the ICRC makes in the efforts to resolve humanitarian problems. I would like to thank once again our colleagues from a number of Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. Without any advertisement, without any fuss, they've been involved in practical matters. They help organize exchange of POWs, the return of the bodies of those perished, and certainly, by way of responding to your question regarding the key humanitarian problems that need to be addressed, I wouldn't say that one humanitarian problem is subsidiary to the other. All humanitarian problems are important. It is important to bring POWs back to their families. It is important to bring back the bodies of those perished so they would be buried in a decent way. And certainly it is important to eliminate all risks emanating due to these situations. For children, this topic of children has been politicized to the max. We've seen mantra from Kyiv that dozens of thousands of Ukrainian kids were abducted by the servicemen of the Russian army, that they are subjected to some kind of tortures. We're talking about dozens of thousands. From day one, when this topic was raised, we asked them, and we still had contacts, and in mid-2025 we had these contacts in Istanbul. For the benefit of these children and to resolve this issue, we asked the Ukrainian negotiating team to provide us with the list of these dozens of thousands of kids. After many reminders, Ukrainians were able to cobble up 399 names. We initially started to double-check them. We asked for the assistance of your distinguished organization, and a huge part of this list of 399 names turned out not to be kids already. They turned out to be not in the territory of Russia, but in Europe. And by the way, this helps confirm our suspicions about the kind of business relating to the trade of kids that some Ukrainian activists started with the help of some Europeans. But once again, we know that the ICRC is ready to identify real facts. I know that you prefer to act in a non-public way to preserve your status of a depoliticized organization. But here we're not talking about politics. We're talking about children that reportedly are missing. If you use your good opportunities to clarify this list, I believe that this in and of itself will be a very serious contribution to our common endeavor. If we talk about humanitarian problems in a more general way, language, religion, too, are also humanitarian aspects, and I once again urge our friends represented here, including the ones who make part of the groups of Friends of Peace in Ukraine, to draw their attention to the rights of Russians and the rights of believers in Ukraine. At the height of all the negotiations and discussions in late November, when the West didn't even want to mention this policy of extermination the Russian language and persecuting the Orthodox Church, while keeping that Ukraine is supporting the European values. In November, the deputy head of the Ukrainian head of the delegation, Kristina Eurovision, stated publicly that there would be no benefits for the Russian language. We will not encourage the genocide that undermines our identity and our language. That means that our cause to protect Russians living in Ukraine, to protect them from the extermination, is called the genocidal thing, genocidal aspiration. If those who contact with the Ukrainian regime drew their attention to these things, I believe that this feeling that Zelensky and his team have, this feeling of complete impunity, well, still it deserves some attention, because having such an attitude, and by the way, another case in point, on the 2nd of December, Mr. Witkov came to Moscow. He had serious proposals, some 5-hour negotiations in the Kremlin, and real problems were discussed very seriously. These problems need to be resolved in order to have a durable peace. The next day, on December 3rd, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted a law in addition to the set of laws that ban the Russian language in all walks of life. They adopted another law that excludes the Russian language from the list of languages that are to be protected in accordance with the European Charter of the regional languages and languages of minorities. Those who represent Europe, all members of this charter of the convention that enshrines such rights, and that is a challenge to the peaceful efforts taken, namely by the special envoy of President Trump. And at this very moment in time, they made such a propaganda step. And in accordance with the quote that I've mentioned, it equals the Russian language to genocide. I believe that you shouldn't have any qualms talking about this publicly. You shouldn't be shy about that. There is nothing but the legitimate demand to respect the international law. Europe is not saying a word, and by doing that, it confirms that encouraging racism, Russophobia, revival of Nazism is something that is in its plans. Thanks a lot. Iran, over to you.
Good afternoon, Minister. I represent the Embassy of Iran. First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this event, this roundtable discussion. This is an event that provides useful and substantial information. I have a question. If I may, I will continue in English.
Regarding to the negotiations between Russia and United States, the question is about the conclusion. I mean, if the current talks between you and United States would not be able to find a political settlement and agreement to end the war regarding the destructive efforts of Europeans, as they say these days, that Mr. Trump maybe withdraw and leave the table of negotiations. The question is, what will be the alternative plan? I mean, the plan of Russia in the case of the failure of negotiations. Thank you.
You know, we never make guesses on what may happen if someone changes their mind or position. We have all reasons to believe, following numerous contacts with the United States, including contacts of our presidents in Alaska, and later contacts with the special representatives of Presidents Putin and Trump, and meetings of the Foreign Minister and State Secretary. We have reasons to believe that the Americans have a sincere wish to settle the conflict in a fair way, ensuring the legitimate interests of all the parties. This is how we proceed. We are still expecting information on the outcome of the contacts between Zelensky, his European masters, and the US administration of Donald Trump. We see various leaks in the mass media. Mostly, as I mentioned, if these leaks are to be believed, they say that the Europeans are only concerned with ensuring the Ukrainian security, with forcing the US to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, disregarding any of Russia's security concerns. And they want to reach an agreement to come up with certain funds to be sent to the Ukraine Restoration Fund. This is a one-sided approach. I have no doubt if that is true. If it's really what Ukraine is talking about with the Europeans, then these approaches have no future. President Putin specifically underlined, as he was making another mention of this topic, and he talked about this during the meeting with Witkoff and Kushner too. President Putin said that Russia is willing and is ready to discuss the security issues with regard of the interests and concerns of all the sides, ensuring a balance of interests on a collective basis under the current reality. This is our position. any others who say that Ukraine's security guarantees are the most important thing, those who want Ukraine to increase its army up to 1 million, or to be more precise, 800,000 people, and to ensure unhindered supplies of weapons for the Ukrainian army, these are the people who are trying to sow a new storm and a new conflict. This is obvious. Europe will cheat in any possible way to achieve their goals. I mentioned the robbery that they are trying to organize, their attempts to steal the sovereign assets of the Central Bank of Russia. We have another example of blatant violation of international law and the so-called rules that the West is so actively promoting. I'm talking about trade in weapons. The weapons produced in the Soviet Union and in Russia, currently located in the European countries and in some of your countries as well. The West is buying all of these weapons all over the world. We have been explaining in various capitals that there is a set of rules in the military and technical cooperation area. It is called the Final User Certificate. If one country is selling weapons to another country, the buyer has no right to transfer these weapons to third parties without the consent of the original seller. But they are disregarding all of these norms. And now they are even proudly stating in public that they're doing that. We've seen a story yesterday. So, several years ago, we delivered an air defense system, a modern one of the best systems, S-400, to the Turkish Republic. Turkey has these systems to the displeasure of the West and the United States. The US, aware of the interest of Turkey to buying F-35 fighter jets from the US, made a condition for Turkey. They said that Turkey will only receive the F-35 fighters if Turkey refuses to keep its S-400 air defense systems. And yesterday, suddenly, the European Union, representing Europe, has decided to purchase the S-400 systems from Turkey to be sent to Ukraine. They are not even thinking about the obligations of Turkey, since they are obliged not to take such steps without the consent of Russia. But the Europeans are not concerned with that. Thereby, they are trying to open a way to deliver the F-35 American fighter jets to Turkey. This is only one example of how Europe disregards all its words about the protection of private property, about the presumption of innocence, the need to follow the rule of law and international law. They are disregarding everything when they need to achieve their goals. Coming back to the question asked by our friend from Bahrain, Europe once again provides proof that it is no accident that throughout the long history, Europe has long been the organizers of all the evils of humanity, starting from colonialism, slavery, World War I, World War II, and Europe once again tries to do something more. Perhaps they forgot that due to the obvious trends of the global political and economic development, Europe is now being left out of the main processes and events. But they still have their instincts, their belligerent instincts and aspirations. They are trying to stay afloat, to stay relevant through their aggressive actions. They are once again showing their nature. Thank you very much. Serbia, please. Thank you. Your Excellency, Minister, this is an important 10th meeting of the ambassadors with you, and I've been present at each of these meetings. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to hear a clearly stipulated position of the Russian Federation regarding important political matters. I can't understand how some of our colleagues, the diplomats, are unwilling to come here if they want to understand how to survive and how to move forward. I can't understand why they are not ready to listen to any information available. I'm leaving the Russian Federation soon, after 4 years, and I would like to seize this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to you as a person who will become a part of the history of diplomacy as one of the greatest diplomats of all times. I'm sure that there is not a single person here who would not share my opinion and who would not be grateful for the privilege of talking to you and meeting you. I have a question and a proposal. My question perhaps has been answered already, but can you say openly, do you see any end to the conflict in the near future, for example, in the next 6 months? Or is there no end to the conflict and a new conflict will follow with different insiders? And here is my proposal related to the conflict. Please send your share of the company Minsk to the government of Serbia or sell it for 1 ruble. And it will return to you in full as soon as the conditions allow. This is my personal proposal without consultations regarding Serbia. If you don't want to answer that, then perhaps President Putin would answer. Thank you very much. Thank you. Speaking of the forecasts of when the conflict in Ukraine will be over, the representatives of Europe are giving specific time frames. Some of them say by spring, some of them say in 2026. We do not waste our time doing that and effort. We have specific tasks to achieve. They have all been clearly stated and stated in public to a certain extent. They have been discussed in great detail in Anchorage and Alaska, where we reached an understanding on how to move forward in an optimal manner to achieve our goals. We don't need a ceasefire or a truce. We need sustainable peace, and we will keep moving forward along this track, regardless of who gives different time frames. The substance matters the most. The substance is ensuring the security of the Russian Federation, as well as ensuring the security of the Russian people, who have been declared terrorists by the Kyiv regime. This is our goal. Speaking of the Serbian oil industry and the situation created by the authorities of the United States regarding this particular company and facility that you mentioned, where the main package of shares belongs to the Russian companies, the negotiation process is ongoing. I'm aware of the fact that the Serbian leadership is communicating with the United States, and it was the United States that made a request that the company should follow the American orders, and in violation of the intergovernmental agreement between Russia and Serbia. This is a specific characteristic of the Americans and their actions. Unfortunately, through their actions, through their unilateral sanctions and abuse of the US dollar, the Americans are undermining the globalization process that had been ongoing for decades and has been seen as the main good for humanity. We are slowly moving through the process of realizing that this is not a good for humanity. This configuration of the global economy only allows a single country to dictate its conditions to the others. And any seriously minded countries who are willing to preserve their sovereignty will be creating their own alternative structures. We will not rely upon the mechanisms that have been proven inefficient and used for suppression of others. Instead, we will rely on our own independent mechanisms that are not subject to any ideological pressure. We are doing this within BRICS, within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and, by the way, within CELAC, the community of Latin American Caribbean countries. I think that the process may be profitable to the authors of these unilateral sanctions. In the long term, their actions are undermining the entire system that is called globalization, which is crumbling before our eyes. Which path shall we choose to move forward? As I mentioned, there is an intergovernmental agreement between Russia and Serbia. The agreement says that there shall be no nationalization without mutual consent regarding the company that you mentioned. How exactly we will move forward, whether it's going to be nationalization or any other way, I do not know. Perhaps the solution is finding a way for continued work of the Serbian oil industry that would not be dependent on the United States. I do not know how we will move forward. This is a negotiation process led by our ministries of energy and our companies, including those in other countries, those neighboring you. These are the companies who are in some way involved with the Serbian oil industry. At the end of the day, I must say that justice should always be the main criteria. I have no doubt about it. Otherwise, we would create a dangerous precedent for many other countries. Nobody wants that. Thank you very much. Sudan, please.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for the briefing and keeping us regularly updated about the situation. You highlighted some issues related to human rights, and I would like here to recall the tragic events unfold in Al-Fashir, in Darfur State, west of Sudan, committed by the RSF and mercenaries, among which are Ukrainian. Unspeakable crimes have been committed with the support of an external actor, known to every one of you. Ukrainians are in Sudan as mercenaries involved in the conflict, committing heinous human rights violations and genocide against the Sudanese people. With the RSF, and the videos were uploaded by themselves to everyone through multimedia. They thought mistakenly to counteract a Russian presence in Sudan in particular, and in Africa in general. I would like to ask about your insights about this, Your Excellency.
I think that here, and through your representatives in Kyiv, perhaps you could talk to them. I am not sure if you have an embassy in Kyiv or not, but perhaps you could address them too and share your position with the Ukrainian government. I believe that they must stop sending their mercenaries. Or if they say that they are not aware of the situation, they should get involved and adopt the necessary measures. Speaking of the situation in Sudan in general, I will say that we have been consistently calling upon our colleagues and upon the government of the head of the Supreme Council and those who are acting against them. We have always been calling all the sides to dialogue. We have made proposals, and we have seen proposals from certain countries that are interested in finding a solution to the conflict. We have seen proposals that our government, your government, should enter into dialogue with those who you called external forces.
Unfortunately, we haven't managed to do that. We haven't established such a dialogue. Nevertheless, such proposal was made and we forwarded this proposal. I believe that now we need to focus not on constantly condemning in public space anyone, but to find a way out, practical solution to this matter. We are ready to contribute to that. We have such opportunities, and if your government is in favor of that, we'll try to use these opportunities.